At the same time, like, I also understand why people want to ban guns. My own dad is anti-gun, and I don't blame him one bit for feeling that way. Like, he, my family's from Afghanistan, and like, he has personally seen what guns do, and what war has done to his homeland, and that informs his like stigma and view around guns. At the same time, he respects my choice and right to arm myself and use guns.
This is Tacticool Girlfriend. She is best known for creating self-defense educational content on YouTube.
I'm outwardly queer. I'm open about it. I'm a lesbian. I'm a trans woman, and I'm not shy about that stuff. I don't make it the like focus of my channel. I don't make my channel very much about who I am per se. But that said, like, I sneak it in here and there. I have a Labrys patch on like all my gear. Um, and I talk about issues regarding queer people in general, especially armed queer people.
Since the election, Tacticool has seen a surge in engagement with her content.
I've also seen a huge, huge increase in interest in my channel and its outlets, social media outlets. There's been a huge like resurgence of interest there. So there's a lot of new people suddenly that have been turned on to me. A lot of people asking for a lot of advice all of a sudden, a lot of new buyers and prospective gun owners.
And it's not only her. Across the nation, there is a variety of self-defense organizations that center marginalized identities. Many of them have seen an increase in demand for education as well.
The demand's grown about 1,800%. Every class that I've scheduled post-election has immediately filled up within the hour.
Today, Tacticool Girlfriend will examine how firearms are an important and limited aspect of defense for marginalized communities. She will be joined by two collectives that also focus on communal defense, the Forward Initiative and Yellow Peril Tactical. As the world is again becoming more volatile, what does it take to keep us safe?
When it comes to teaching de-escalation versus guns, well, guns are easier, right? They're a tool. People know they are a trump card, and they're options that at the end of the day, if they had to use deadly force, a firearm gives them that option, right? De-escalation doesn't really work against an angry mob, right? It doesn't really work that well when someone has firmly decided to do you harm.
This is Blake Alvarenga, founder of the Forward Initiative, a nonprofit in Madison, Wisconsin that offers free and inclusive firearm education.
People really need this education. If we don't provide it to them, they won't get it somewhere else, and they can and will be gun owners, if not today, but soon.
The post-election surge has challenged the Forward Initiative, but for Blake, meeting the demand for education is a matter of communal safety.
I got an email from a young woman. She said, "There's no class availability right now. I'll just go ahead and buy a gun and take a class when there's a class available." And that breaks my heart.
As more people turn to a lethal self-defense tool in the United States, it is important to ensure that they are provided appropriate education. In the context of historically oppressed communities, what does that education look like?
Firearms definitely pose an imminent risk of turning into a talisman that wards off evil and harm. That is the thing that starts to seep in and kind of lull people into a false sense of security. This isn't a super often talked about part of it, but it needs to be, because the way that people relate to their firearms once they get minimally comfortable around them starts to get cavalier and unsafe.
This is Yoshko from Yellow Peril Tactical, a collective of East and Southeast Asians doing firearm education, celebrating history, and uplifting struggles across Asia and the diaspora.
Firearms are undoable final last resort of community self-defense.
To Yoshko, guns are a tool requiring utmost responsibility, but that's not the case for everyone.
I'm not going to defend the gun community and firearms owning community at large because they haven't earned it. There's a lot of irresponsible firearms touting, carrying, and content making out there.
I think most firearm owners don't do themselves justice as being good firearm owners. And so I just like want to add a more sobering voice to the conversation.
Mainstream gun culture in the United States tends to center the average gun owner, a conservative leaning white man, ignoring the lived realities of marginalized individuals.
I had been coming across a lot of like Asian American, pretty narrowly defined in terms of like East Asian, like gun groups, but they were like uniformly pretty like conservative libertarian or just like apolitical, which just winds up being like pretty conservative. None of it really like was intended for me, very obviously. It was for like Asian men who are like considered like the breadwinners for like a standard nuclear family.
For multiply marginalized individuals like Yoshko, finding a community that provides firearm education relevant to their full self is even more challenging. But tonight's guests all share the principle of tailoring the education to their community.
When it comes to educating the community about firearms or concealed carry or the use of force, you have to go just beyond the minimum standards set aside by certifying organizations. You need to give that practical context in what it means in your daily life to have a firearm as part of your lifestyle and in your household, and on your person if you decide to conceal carry.
The legal baseline of firearm education is rarely sufficient for those who are discriminated by the same legal system.
While, the law should be applied fairly, it rarely is done so, right? When we talk about firearm ownership and how that changes depending on who you are, it's a real thing. And people should be considerate of it and understand how their lived experience and who they are impacts them as a firearm owner if they decide to be one.
Focusing on how tools of defense function within the frameworks of different identities and lived contexts is what guides the educational content of the Forward Initiative, Tacticool Girlfriend, and Yellow Peril Tactical.
For queer people being more at risk for suicide and mental health struggles in general, mixing with firearms can be very volatile, and like that is just real. That is a reality that we need to account for, especially as queer gun owners. I definitely like try to put out some good information about that every once in a while. I have a video on firearm suicide prevention, and I feel like that's a topic that a lot of mainstream people on YouTube in the gun world are not really talking about, and that should be a thing that applies to everyone really, because suicide is the leading cause of firearm-related deaths.
While any experience of oppression increases the complexity of firearm education, certain intersections of marginalization may be incompatible with gun ownership.
How the legal system interprets the law and applies it to individuals and people of all sorts of marginalized backgrounds tend to be stigmatized one way or another by the legal system. They tend to be targeted and judged and held to a different standard than a lot of other people who are perceived to be more of the mainstream. So, especially when you are an immigrant, especially when you're at risk for deportation, uh, that is absolutely stacking your your own threat profile against yourself.
But firearms are not the only means of defending yourself.
I absolutely hound on people to always carry non-lethal means of self-defense no matter what, because that's always going to be more practical in your everyday activities than resorting to lethal means of self-defense, which are extremely niche in terms of legal justification in most situations of self-defense. And pepper spray is cheap, it's accessible, it's easier to train on and get effective with than anything else. Is it the answer to every self-defense scenario? No, but I think that like anyone serious about actual self-defense needs to start with that.
There are a lot of alternatives to using a firearm, right? We talk about it in depth in the concealed carry licensing class the Ford Initiative puts on for free, where there are a lot of situations where you're de-escalating, or in the sense of like someone's running off with your dog. Well, you can't shoot them, but you can use kung fu. There's a lot of things that you can do outside of arming yourself with firearms or using firearms in a lot of situations, because that's one of the most rarest uses of force and self-defense is going to be guns. It gets a lot of attention, that's for sure, but a shove, a strong word, there's a lot of things that happen a lot more often and are very effective.
Whether guns or kung fu, application of any self-defense tool requires training.
A lot of people have the assumption that if they have pepper spray, they can use it. I would really encourage people to pick up a trainer and see how well they can actually get it out of their pocket or their purse, their bag, their backpack, off their keys, and use it effectively.
Regardless of whether or not someone chooses to become a gun owner, providing gun education in a country with more guns than people is essential. It is important to know how to safely approach a firearm, even if you do not plan to use it for self-defense, simply because they are so prevalent in the United States.
I'm not asking them to give out guns or endorse gun ownership, but we need the opportunity to teach people. People can and do buy firearms every day without any education, without anyone giving them the opportunity to be as safe and responsible as they could be.
For those who are able and willing to become owners, education continues beyond the classroom and needs to be tailored to their lived circumstances too.
Having a mentality that is cultivated and not one that's like based on fantasies that you brought in, or like feel good, like feelings that you're chasing around, like I want to be a protector because of the way that makes me feel, and that's how I want to derive worth from the world. Like that's a fine reason to start, but like there needs to be, I think, a broader sense of like, no, I'm just a person. I'm a regular person. Like, yes, I'm willing to like sacrifice a lot, and there's a lot to think about your own life and about what you're willing to risk.
Owning firearms responsibly requires separation from the mainstream gun culture. Much of popular online content frames guns as fun rather than lethal, in part because platforms like YouTube profit more from entertainment than education.
I do agree that, like, personally, I think guns can be fun. I like to go to competitions, and while that is like a serious test of my own skill and it does inform my training and it is like a serious application of a serious tool and a serious skill set, like that isolated event can be fun. Firearms are tools. They are definitely hardware that has no morality or value in of itself. It's the context that gives it all of those properties. But that said, like we live in a very volatile world where firearms do hold a place in violence in general. It is like the contemporary means of violence for a lot of the violence that you can account for on this planet. So like, you can call it a tool that it is, just like a hammer is a tool, but like a hammer is not meant to primarily kill people. A gun absolutely is designed for that sole purpose. That is why they exist. And anything else is secondary to that.
Responsibility begins with an accurate understanding of the tool and the recognition that a firearm impacts not just you, but the surrounding community.
Being open to like being checked and being like called in by people around you is also an important like disposition to have, I think, around this type of thing. Is like, yeah, if people have problems or feel uncomfortable with the way I relate to firearms, I would want to know about that.
When guns are framed as fun and easy, responsibility becomes warped into something you can acquire.
You have to disabuse yourself of the idea that you get to a destination with firearms ownership. Responsibility gets like touted as the big reason for carrying, but it's more just like this ever evolving thing that means something different on a day-to-day basis. It really is just like your ability to read situations and trust in your own judgment that this decision is all about to like carry on any given day. And yeah, I think it's important to just assess constantly and reassess constantly throughout the day, even like how's my how's my keenness, my like my perception doing right now? Am I like really tired? Like do I need a nap? Um, or am I feeling like super heightened? Like am I finding myself thinking about like feeling in danger and like scanning for threats when I don't necessarily need to be? Like that is a highly exhausting activity. It is definitely like a part of like situational awareness and changing your situational awareness around relating to firearms because it definitely like affects your psyche and there's a lot of like neurological things that you need to be able to regulate your emotions like a different kind of way as well.
Basing decisions on the ever-changing lived context is what establishes responsible ownership.
It is this conundrum where you are simultaneously more at risk for having violence enacted upon you, whether that's immediate violence by a random person in the streets or violence that is structural through things like the legal system. And at the same time, you have to like see if taking up arms for whatever reason is going to help address that without disproportionately making you more at risk for persecution or not. And it is a complicated topic. It is not something that like I can give you a blanket answer and say, you know, if you're X, Y, and Z, then do A, B, and C. Um, but like you have to take inventory of all of these risks. You have to take inventory of your threat profile. You have to make that based in reality and not just like some fear in your head of what you imagine your scariest, worst nightmare might be. And it really just needs to be weighed against those factors. And no one can really do that except for yourself, because you know yourself better than anybody.
Whether or not firearms are appropriate for a community's defense strategy, it takes many other tools to keep us safe.
If not your household, who's going to help you when a situation arises? A gun isn't going to, help you with the ladder. Your neighbors are. And I really encourage people to go outside of their household, talk with people they share a wall with or a yard with.
Focusing on guns as the solution to violence in our communities, whether by bringing them in or out, takes away from the many other systems and tools that impact our safety.
At the same time, like in context, you have to absolutely accept the fact that like gun violence is a problem. It is definitely a problem. And so like how do we not attack the symptoms, but the actual root causes of violence that causes people to be violent in the first place? That is a way more interesting conversation than like regulating the means that people are currently using. Because I mean, if it's not guns, it's going to be knives, you know, especially like in the UK, that is a problem. And if it's not knives and it's rocks and sticks, like it's always been a problem. Violence has always been a problem. So like I'm interested in conversations about how we mitigate violence, whether that's immediate physical violence or structural violence. It all is tied together.
The more constitutive important parts are like say feeding your community, housing, right? Like class vulnerabilities. Like if you are poor um, and living really anywhere, but like in the context of the United States, like you are way, way more likely to experience violence and violence that like really like it's not a sure thing whether like the criminal justice system is even going to get involved. But if it does, it's almost uniformly negative and messing up your life like considerably. And so like the things that mitigate against that and protect communities against that are like number one, housing and being fed, having access to healthcare, having access to education, like having access to like free resources and like mutually supportive resources. All of those things are way, way more important everyday parts of self-defense.
In order to resolve hunger, homelessness, and other symptoms of poverty on a level beyond personal, communities need to foster a dedication to responsibility.
What are your commitments? It raises that question for me, like what's your commitment to your community? Because like no one person is like preventing people from falling into poverty. Like this isn't with the like uh, idea that there's people out there like saving their community single-handedly, because that's just not how mutual aid and community defense works. Like everyone just like has a commitment to each other, and everyone kind of just like does their best to uphold it. At least that's like the goal.
Like with firearm ownership, upholding communal responsibility requires strong communication networks that help us accommodate for each other's living conditions.
Like, if you had to talk with people in your neighborhood or community, could you do it without social media? Could you do it without Nextdoor or a Facebook group or Reddit? Having those personal connections is the key point that people need to take away when they think about community defense and community resiliency, is having other people around us. And then you go from there, right? Can you garden? Not necessarily because you're going to produce enough food to live off of, but having the skills in the first place. If you ever had to turn your yard into a garden, could you? Do you know how to grow a tomato? Do you know how to keep it healthy through a growing season? If something happened in your household, could you go to your neighbors and stay with them? What if you ran out of gas and there's a gas shortage? Do you know someone who'll give you a ride to work? What if the buses aren't there? Do you have a bike? Well, who repairs bikes in your neighborhood? Do you go to the bicycle recycle, or is there some handy person in your neighborhood? When it comes to community, it's really trying to take a look around you and understand what your community can do for you and what you can do for your community. It goes both ways.
We do also at the same time have this current of like romanticizing collapse and kind of awaiting these collapse moments, or these like crumbles that are happening slowly, like um, unpredictably, and that is the thing that I think people are more distracted by and fixated on, and it's probably like it's something to prepare for, right? I'm not saying don't be prepared, but I am saying just have a wider understanding and get involved and be involved in your community. Like relational security, knowing each other, knowing and being known is the first step in defense.